Hey nerds, so I'm going to talk about Foucault here.
Michel Foucault is one of the most...
So Michel Foucault, obviously, I'm going to continue my series on his book, The Order of Things. I've, of course, gone almost all the way through History of Sexuality, so check out all those videos. I have a playlist, and I don't think I made a playlist for the Order of Things videos yet. I should do that. But anyway, I'm going to continue my series on his book called The Order of Things. And in this particular paragraph I'm going to get into, he's talking about language, truth, history, being, and power, and relate this to Heidegger's theory of being with another philosopher talking about him. And so before I continue, everyone, please subscribe to the channel, like, share, comment. I'm actually interacting with the comments now, so I will pay attention to you. Even if you're being a dickhead, I will mock and ridicule you because that's what you deserve. So anyway, also you can give me a one-time tip on Patreon. You can give me any amount of money per month on Patreon. If you order anything at all on Amazon through my link, I'll get a little kickback at no extra cost to you. And at my PayPal link there too, if you want to give me a one-time donation, and check out my Rumble page and subscribe to that as well. I greatly appreciate all that. All right, we'll get into this guy talking about Foucault in general here, and then I'll get into the paragraph.
Controversial and enigmatic of contemporary thinkers. And there's more than one reason for the controversy surrounding Foucault. He died in 1984 of AIDS, and his death was quite conspicuous. Various rumors floated around about the circumstances of his death, and it got him a considerable amount of publicity, which his writings might not otherwise have obtained because they are...
Yeah, because so Foucault, obviously, famously or infamously, depending on how you look at it, he was a gay dude who was into BDSM and had too much unprotected sex, so he died of AIDS in the 80s. So that's why I call him my favorite 70s pervert post-structuralist philosopher.
Difficult, some of them are quite impenetrable, and although they've been very influential...
Some of his work is quite impenetrable, yes. I like to always say, he's Foucault, as along with many other philosophers, but people like Foucault in particular, maybe even post-structuralists in particular, tend to be extremely verbose, pedantic, and obtuse as much as possible. However, unlike pseudo-intellectual crackpots like Jordan Peterson, they're actually making really interesting and profound points often. He's often making dumb points and then just using pseudo-intellectual crackpot language.
In intellectual circles, for the most part, his influence hasn't gotten too far beyond that. Political activism to some extent, but for the most part, Michel Foucault is a product of and a creature of the academic intellectual world. He was a fascinating...
Yeah, this is important to emphasize too, because dumbasses like Jordan Peterson endlessly claim that Foucault was a Marxist and Derrida was a Marxist, even though they definitely weren't. They were like very impressed by Marxism when they were younger, and then they were disillusioned by it, and they both heavily criticized it a lot of the time. A lot of the best criticisms of Marxism come from postmodernists. A lot of the best criticisms of postmodernism come from Marxists. And like I always like to quote in History of Sexuality, one of Foucault's quote is, "Government is the only fatal form of power." He was a fucking anarchist. He wasn't a Marxist, dude.
Sort of Byronic or Promethean figure. In some respects, he's a figure like Dionysus, something out of the tradition of French Romanticism. Someone that emphasizes powerful sentiments, strong emotions, a very vivid and deep interiority. But the cost of this is a sort of, well, a dark side, a sort of affiliation with death, a fixation with death, an interest in power, almost to the point of an obsession, and a powerful...
Yeah, of course, people critique how basically his whole theory of truth, language, history, and everything is like partially that those in power decide how we define these things and how we look at reality. But also, like I often like to emphasize, he very clearly emphasizes his opinion that power is not always bad, because it's a tool that can be used for good, because oppressed people can use power to rise up against their oppressors and take over their power, and then they could eventually possibly end up using their power in a bad way and oppressing their oppressors, right? So power is a tool and it's complex and it can be used in various different ways, which is just the nature of reality.
Critical intelligence, which tended to dissolve and undermine whatever claims were made to substantiate or legitimize whatever field of thought Michel Foucault applied himself to inquire into. The result of his inquiries, the result of his intellectual work, was an anti-humanism, a sort of inverted pantheism in which he takes Nietzsche's idea of the will.
What he means by anti-humanism is that it's more his idea that there isn't like an essence to a true essence to humanity, that this idea of being human and that they're anthropological and sociological universals throughout history and culture throughout time. He thinks that none of those true statements based on that ever remain true. Nothing in terms of language, history, truth, being, any other number of things. He's saying that these ways that we use to define reality and what it means to be human are like, basically, he wouldn't say they're bullshit, but he'd say they're very poorly thought out and don't stand up to scrutiny at all, I'd say.
To power as far as it can possibly be taken. He says that there is no legitimizing meta-discourse for our moral judgments, for our political judgments, for our estimations of self and society. Rather, there is merely power, there is merely desire, there's merely our relationship to the completely contingent, to the utterly arbitrary.
Okay, the relationship between power and desire, for example, is that power has influence on our desires, and our desires have influence on power and who we have power over, and how we choose to use that power based on our desires, and how we choose to let power influence our desires. It's always two-way a two-way relationship between these things when Foucault talks about them.
In some respects, I would say that Michel Foucault's intellectual project is very much like the stance towards being that we find in the novels of William Burroughs.
Okay, so that's actually a good place to stop. He's getting to being there. I don't need to get any more into his explanation of Foucault there. So we'll get into the start of this paragraph and on the order of things, and then I'm going to go to this video with this guy talking about Heidegger and his theory of being in time. Actually, I think I went too far back in that here. So I'm going to go somewhere around there, and then just bear with me here. I will share this before I read the Foucault paragraph. Right here. Here we go. All right. So first I'll get into the part of the paragraph here, like I was talking about. So basically, Foucault's getting into his whole theory of history, language, history, language, power, being, and truth. So I'll get into it here. So, oops. So right off the bat, he uses the word archaeology. And of course, for those of you who've seen these other videos, you know that what he means by archaeology is like archaeology in sort of an anthropological sense. So basically, like, he's doing an intellectual excavation of ideas. It's not like literally archaeologists digging up ancient ruins and all that kind of stuff. He's talking about like intellectually intellectually using archaeologically excavating ideas, how they came into being, how they influence history, how they influence the way we look at reality. So that's what he means when he says archaeology. All right. Archaeology, however, must examine each event in terms of its own evident arrangement. It will recount how the configurations proper to each positivity were modified. Yeah, so like this way that we look at the history of ideas in culture, um, we can see how they've been modified throughout history, because obviously language changes throughout history, and how we use language affects how we view the truth of reality. So we recount how the configurations proper to each positivity were modified. In the case of grammar, for example, it will analyze the eclipse of the major role hitherto accorded to the name of grammar. So the definition of grammar, it doesn't change completely. Like it's not as if the definition of grammar changes to like pink horses sometimes, but it changes, which changes language throughout history, as he keeps emphasizing, right? Okay, so the exact counterpart of these events is to be found in the area of language analysis, though it is true that they take a more discrete form and obey a slower chronology than in the field of natural history. He means like the history of these ideas, not like these nefarious conspiratorial people, the way dumbasses like Jordan Peterson would interpret. No, that wasn't a good impression. Jordan Peterson. That's better. All right. There is an easily discoverable reason for this. I'll repeat that other sentence first. Though it is true that they take a more discrete form and obey a slower chronology than in the field of natural history. I don't know why I'm having some trouble saying chronology than in the field of natural history. There is an easily discoverable reason for this. It is that throughout the classical age, language was posited and reflected upon as discourse, that is, as the spontaneous analysis of representation. So that makes sense. Discourse, or like discussing, or like pinning ideas against each other in writing or intellectually or something like that, is a discourse, and we figure out language through discourse. We use language to figure out language, which is interesting. So that makes sense, right? And this leads to the theory a theory of representation in terms of truth. And he's going to get into, and he's going to, well, actually I'll explain that first. So like the theory of representation of truth is basically just what it sounds like, that what is true re- or yeah, what is true represents reality. So if something is true, it's like I'm a person because in reality I am a person to this to everyone else, which as you can imagine is a very sloppy and ambiguous and often dumb definition of truth. And the post-structuralist criticism of the representation theory of truth in the work of people like Foucault and Derrida is very good on that subject. But anyway, we don't need to get back into that specifically here. All right, so um, okay. So there's an easily discoverable reason for this. It is that throughout the classical age, language was posited and reflected upon as discourse, that is, as the spontaneous analysis of representation. Of all the forms of non quantitative order, it was the most immediate, the least deliberate, the most profoundly linked to the movement of representation itself. So there was a whole movement in philosophy, and specifically the philosophy of language, about the representation theory of truth. And they weren't necessarily acknowledging that they use that theory of truth, especially if you're just talking about linguists, right? They just make this assumption when they're doing something. So they, like, not with any nefarious intent, of course, use their power to use this representation theory of truth to create an altered language, which means language is being altered through discourse by people who decide what words mean, which doesn't mean any nefarious conspiracy. It's just how reality works, which doesn't, again, like I've said 1,000 times, doesn't mean that any post-structuralist is a relativist. No one's a fucking relativist. It just means that there are different ways of looking at truth, and there's not always one way that's the most correct way of looking at truth. And there's some more interesting and better ways of looking at truth that people like Foucault and Derrida use all the time. That's all they mean. And I keep mentioning him, of course, but dumbasses like Jordan Peterson clearly don't even read Foucault's fucking books. All right. So, anyway, of all the forms of non quantitative order, it was the most immediate, the least deliberate, and the most profoundly linked to the movement of representation itself. And to that extent, it was more firmly rooted in representation and in the mode of being of representation than were the more intellectual orders, disinterested or interested, based upon the classification of beings or the exchange of wealth. So He also, of course, which makes him sound Marxist, even though he's not a Marxist, he's talking about the philosophy of wealth. Get over yourself. He talks about in terms of language and how power influences the truth of what we see as the truth of language. It also influences how we see wealth, how we quantify it, how we use it, the fact that we use wealth to buy and sell things. Obviously, there are different monetary values and monetary systems throughout the world, and they've changed, and there's inflation, deflation, all the complex aspects of economics. But the point is that the idea of wealth is based on a representationist theory of truth. All right, so based upon the classification of beings or the exchange of wealth, technical modifications such as those that affected the measurement of exchange values or the methods of arriving at characters were sufficient to change considerably the analysis of wealth or natural history. That's pretty straightforward. The analysis of wealth and natural history changes as our definition of truth changes based on using power based on our discourse, those in power using their discourse to change definitions of truth and that kind of thing. I don't know why I'm moving my mic around so much. Oh, it's a substitute for talking with my hands. um okay, so and then he gets into the 17th and 18th century, which he focuses on mostly in most or all of his books, the Enlightenment period, 16 and 1700s, sometimes the 1800s too. Okay, so yeah, and he gets into science too, and of course, he's very critical of science. He's not anti-science, as some people say, but he's critical of like the way science is done and how throughout history scientists have believed things that they think are true that turn out to be false. Like eugenics is an obvious example. Phrenology, measuring skulls to separate the races. Their I forget what the word is, but the theory that the sun revolves around the earth rather than the other way around. One is heliocentric. I forget what the other one is named. But anyway, so he's talking about the history of the truth of language, wealth, and science, and he's going to get in terms of the history of how all of these things were impacted during enlightenment culture, how enlightenment culture in the 17th and 18th centuries heavily impacted what we see as true in terms of language, power, wealth, um, language, power, wealth, science, and truth, many of the most important aspects of society. All right, so technical modifications such as those that affected the measurement of exchange values or the methods of arriving at characters were sufficient to change considerably the analysis of wealth or natural history. In order that the science of language could undergo mutations as important as these, he means like metaphorical mutations, obviously. Even profounder events were necessary, events capable of changing the very being of representations in Western culture. All right, so now we'll go into this Heidegger video here, and I'll explain being a little bit. Obviously, Foucault is not meaning it in the Heideggerian sense because he uses a cap or a lowercase b. Heidegger tends to use a capital B for being, although he separates capital B being from smaller b being and smaller b beings. Of course, it's very almost deliberately confusing, as tends to happen with philosophers, and Heidegger does that as much as Foucault, in my opinion. But we'll get into the video here. Oh shit, I have it muted.
On the Gospel of John, Heidegger gave seminars on Luther in Bultmann's seminar series. So it was a genuine collaboration between two people who had a great theologian. One often gets the impression that Bultmann, as it were, got all his ideas from Heidegger and simply applied them to the New
different
Testament.
jobs he had.
I think it's clear if you look at the history of that relationship that it was both ways, and they would meet regularly in Bultmann's between two people who had a Being and Time was published in 1920.
That's one of his foundational ideas.
So Heidegger's 38 at the time, and this enabled him to take up the chair of philosophy at the University of Freiburg and to go back to Freiburg now as.
And he was getting into before that a lot of Heidegger's early career of philosophical thought, in which he does a lot of theology and works with theologians and based off of a lot of theologians, like the work of John Duns Scotus, for example. And he did used to be a Catholic, and then he eventually, I don't know if I would say converted, but he like switched to his kind of own unique kind of Protestantism, kind of in the same way that philosophers have their own somewhat unique view of on religion, like Hegel in particular, among countless others, of course, right?
Professor. This is in many ways a high point of his career. The low point was soon to follow, namely when he accepted becoming rector of Freiburg University in 1933, and at the same time became a member of the Nazi Party. And of course,
yes, this is well known about Heidegger. He has very interesting philosophy, most of which does not mention anything about his fascist Nazi ideology. But there is one book, I forget the name of it, in which he kind of lays it out. I think one of them is called The Black Notes or something like that. And of course, I mentioned before his student, Husserl, who's the founder of phenomenology, which was one of Heidegger's main focuses. Heidegger was Husserl's student, and then Heidegger joined, and Husserl was Jewish, and then Heidegger joined the Nazi Party, and he didn't defend Husserl when the Nazis came after him, even though he was his student. He was a terrible person, but had some interesting thoughts. That can happen, obviously.
Is something that has dogged the whole perception of.
Actually, I don't think he gets back to being here, but just I'll try to explain briefly. Basically, like I've said before, so Heidegger says that there is uppercase B, being, which is just like a state or essence of reality. And then there's smaller case b, beings. We are beings, humans, living creatures, are smaller b, beings. We are being. So being as a verb, he uses being as a verb, a noun, and I guess two different types of nouns. So capital B being, capital B being is like a fundamental aspect of reality is being. You could basically look at it as a metaphysical essence of being permeating the universe. And so smaller b beings are being, just living and existing. So humans are existing in being. So that's why Heidegger gets deliberately confusing and basically says that being beings are being in being. That, like I said, human beings are being or existing in larger case B being. It gets complicated, but anyway, we'll get more into his Nazi history here because it's interesting.
Heidegger ever since. It's true that he left the party. It remains highly debated as to what his relations with the party were. He stepped down as rector after just over a year. His own telling of the story is that he was pretty disillusioned with the Nazis by the middle of the 1930s. Others suggest contrary evidence. It's a very, very muddy and murky period, but there's no doubt that even on a best reading, Heidegger certainly didn't cover himself with glory. And the worst reading is a lot worse than that.
Obviously.
And of course, that then also raises the question as to whether his Nazism was simply a kind of personal foible, a bit of careerist opportunism, perhaps, or whether there is something about his work itself, about his ideas, that contributed to that step.
Yeah, that's highly debatable.
Recently, a very controversial book was published in France by a philosopher called Emmanuel Faye, called Heidegger, The Introduction of Nazism into Philosophy. And Faye finds some sort of reference to Nazism in just about every line Heidegger ever wrote. And I think most people think that's clearly an exaggeration, and sometimes even perhaps rather stupid and forced. But it is a sort of question hanging around the interpretation of Heidegger, and some texts more than others seem to be very susceptible to that kind of reading. The war ended, of course, in catastrophe for Germany, and catastrophe for Heidegger himself. He had a mental breakdown for a while, and in the denazification program, he was banned from teaching. So he had to step down from his university post and was reinstated in 1950, a year before his retirement. During this period, a number of new themes started to emerge in his thought, not least the critique of technology in some exceptionally dense and difficult lectures.
So I didn't actually know that some of his other most fundamental ideas, question concerning technology, basically came after his Nazism, or after he was a member of the party, at least. That's very interesting.
Which, funnily enough, because of the circumstances of his having been stood down from his university post, were given to a business club in Bremen, something like the Rotary Club.
So, yeah, I'll stop it there. And I am going to, I will stop sharing that and make myself bigger. And I will continue reading the rest of this paragraph. All right. So, it's really complex, but like the point is that Foucault is mostly just focusing on kind of the main point of this book, or one of the main points, which is that throughout history, the way we understand truth changes, which means that which means that language changes, and as history changes, it changes language, and then those in power decide based on changes in history, changes in language throughout history, which became more of a thing during the Enlightenment, when this whole Enlightenment notion of truth came about. So basically, that language, history, truth, or power changes language, history, and truth throughout history. That's basically the main point, that power and history transform the truth of language and everything else in reality. All right, so now we'll finish off the paragraph here. And I only brought in Heidegger because it's interesting to think about being, the Heideggerian sense of being, in the context of how history changes the way we understand reality and the definitions of words and the definition of truth. All right, so in order that the science, here we go. In order that the science of language could undergo mutations as important as these, even profounder events were necessary, events capable of changing the very being of representations in Western culture. Just as in the 17th and 18th century, the theory of the name had its place as near as possible to representation. So language, basically, as possible to representation, and thus governed, to a certain degree, the analysis of structures and character in living beings, smaller b beings, lower b being, he said earlier, right? So we don't have to, obviously Foucault doesn't look at being in the Heideggerian sense, but I just think it's interesting to look at it that way. Okay, so just as in the 17th and 18th centuries, the theory of the name had its place as near as possible to representation, and thus governed, to a certain degree, the analysis of structures and character in living beings. Of course, Foucault likes to be fucking verbose and use endlessly run-on sentences, right? To a certain degree, the analysis of structures and character in living beings, and that of price and value in the sphere of wealth. So, of course, if we're talking about the nature of how truth and language changes, obviously we're talking earlier about how there's so many different aspects to how wealth changes throughout history, obviously, too, right? Okay, so thus govern to a certain degree the analysis of structures and character in living beings, and that of price and value in the sphere of wealth. So in the same way, at the end of the classical age, or you could say somewhat similar to the Enlightenment, though it's probably a slightly different period of history. So in the same way, at the end of the classical age, it was this theory that subsisted longest. I lost my place. Here it is. Sorry. So, in the same way, at the end of the classical age, it was this theory that subsisted the longest, breaking up only late in the day at the moment when representation itself was modified at the deepest level of its archaeological organization. That's a good way to end the paragraph. He starts it with archaeology and he ends it with archaeology. So this is Foucault's long and verbose way of doing an intellectual excavation of basically the nature of how, specifically in this paragraph, language and truth change, or the truth of how we see language, and the represent in terms of the representationist theory of truth. So basically, Foucault's main point in this video is that throughout history, our the def we throughout history we use our power to change the definition of truth, change the definition of different words in languages, change how we see wealth, and change how everything represents reality. So basically, in a nutshell, Foucault would say that history endlessly changes the nature of objective truth and reality. He's not a relativist, as I only say, right? But the true nature of we are always changing the true nature of reality ourselves. So history reprograms our mind and we transform reality. So humans transform truth. Truth is never the same. I'd say there is no objective truth, but that would be an objective truth statement. So I think there's most likely no such thing as objective truth. But anyway, the truth, as Foucault points out in a nutshell, the truth is always changing. All right. So everyone, as usual, please click like on the video, click the bell, be notified when I come out with new videos, share, subscribe, comment. Even if you're a dickhead, I'm going to mock and ridicule you because that's what you deserve. And I actually like some of the interesting, thought-provoking comments that someone gave me on my video about whether the sun is conscious. So that's very good too. And yeah, if you click my Amazon link, you can order anything at all on there, and I get a little kickback at no extra cost to you. Please give me any amount of money you want on Patreon, 1, 5, 10, any amount you want. And you can also give me a one-time tip on there. And I have my PayPal link where you can give me a one-time donation, and also subscribe to my Rumble page too. That all helps me out a lot. I greatly appreciate it. And yeah, I think all those links are in the description of the video below this video, of course. And thanks everyone. And adios until next time. Keep being nerds.